story begins with Matthew, a young man facing one of life's toughest challenges, starting over at a new school where he doesn't know a single soul. Burdened by the fear that his appearance will make him an easy target for bullies, his anxiety quickly turns into resentment. Tension runs high at home as he blames his mother for uprooting his life. In his eyes, her decision to remarry cost him everything: his home, his friends, and his sense of belonging, all so she could pursue her own happiness with someone new. On his first day at the new school, Matthew unintentionally turned heads by showing up in a formal suit, an awkward contrast to the laid-back attire of his classmates. The first to comment was Nick, but his teasing was lighthearted rather than cruel. In fact, Nick quickly offered to show Matthew around, easing some of the initial tension. Not long after, he introduced Matthew to Ruby, another kind and friendly student. Thanks to their warmth and support, Matthew began to feel less like an outsider and found himself with two unexpected new friends. During lunch, Matthew was instantly drawn to Teresa, the most beautiful and admired girl at school. Summoning his courage, he made the bold decision to approach her and ask her out. But before he could get close, the school's notorious antagonist, Hector, who also happened to be Teresa's boyfriend, intervened. With no warning, Hector asserted his dominance with a brutal punch, knocking Matthew to the ground and mocking him in front of everyone. That evening, back at home, Matthew simmered with frustration, overwhelmed by feelings of helplessness and humiliation. It hit Matthew how quickly he had become a target for bullies. Just then, his stepfather, Ray, walked in and casually asked about his first day at school. "It was fine," Matthew muttered, offering a curt reply as he tried to slip away, eager to avoid any deeper conversation. But Ray's gaze settled on the boxing posters lining the bedroom wall. Spotting a chance to connect, he handed Matthew a book about Muhammad Ali, one of the greatest boxing legends in history. Matthew, however, barely reacted, pretending not to care as he brushed off the gesture. Matthew had no desire to bond with Ray, much less build any kind of relationship with him. Still, over time, he grew attached to the book, clutching it like a lifeline and taking it with him wherever he went. But one morning at school, Hector, knowing full well that Matthew wouldn't fight back, took his bullying to a new level. With no warning, he poured a cup of juice over Matthew's book and shirt, drenching him in front of a laughing crowd. Just as Matthew braced himself for more humiliation, an unexpected figure stepped in: Dan, the school janitor. Still, there was something about Dan that hinted he was more than just a janitor. Without saying much, he stepped in with quiet authority, pulling Hector and his crew away and giving Matthew a moment to retreat with whatever dignity he had left. But the reprieve didn't last. Later during lunch, Hector caught Matthew watching the school boxing team tryouts and saw yet another opportunity to embarrass him. With a barrage of insults, he once again made Matthew the target of mockery. Nick quickly stepped in to defend his friend, but when the fallout came, it was swift and unforgiving. Only Matthew and Nick were punished, while Hector got off without so much as a warning. That evening at home, the weight of it all became too much for Matthew to carry alone. Unable to keep everything bottled up any longer, he finally confided in his mom and stepfather, revealing the truth about what he'd been going through. Determined to take control of his life, Matthew asked his mom for permission to join a gym and learn how to defend himself. At first, she was firmly opposed, afraid that training would only push him further toward violence and more trouble. But Ray, who understood all too well what it meant to feel powerless, gently persuaded her to give Matthew a chance. The next day, as Matthew stepped into the gym, a surge of intimidation washed over him. The steady thuds of fists pounding heavy bags, the blur of rapid punches, and the charged air filled with focus and grit made his heart pound. Yet beneath the nerves, something stirred an excitement at the thought of one day matching that skill and strength. Just then, Coach Howard stepped forward, his eyes scanning the room before announcing that qualifying rounds would soon be held to determine the official team members. Just then, Matthew spotted Hector and his friend Joy entering the gym, already guaranteed spots on the team, unlike the others who'd have to fight for theirs. Doubt crept in, and Matthew quietly gathered his things, ready to slip out unnoticed. But at the exit, he came face to face with Dan. "If you keep running, fear will always win," Dan said firmly. "Punches hurt for a moment, but fear stays unless you face it." Dan's words echoed in Matthew's mind, igniting something deep inside. With a steady breath, he turned back and stepped into position, ready to face Hector. Wasting no time, Hector turned the match into a show of dominance, landing blow after blow. Matthew couldn't fight back, not a single punch. All he could do was withstand the beating, taking each hit in silence as the crowd watched. Finally, Coach Howard stepped in and called off the match. As the crowd dispersed, Matthew stayed on the floor, his body aching, but the weight of disappointment heavier than the pain. Dan returned, standing over him with arms crossed, his face unreadable. Seeing the defeat in Matthew's eyes, Dan sat beside him and shared his own story. He had once been a boxing champion at the peak of his career until poor choices brought him down. Now, he worked as a janitor, hoping to redeem himself. Dan looked Matthew in the eye and promised to teach him everything he knew, personally training him after school. Early on, Dan noticed a major issue: Matthew's stamina was dangerously low. He wasn't out of shape, but he tired quickly. It soon became clear Matthew was a leukemia survivor, and years of treatment had drained his endurance. Still, for as long as he could remember, he had dreamed of becoming a boxer. His mother, worried about his health, had never allowed him near a gym, gloves, or the ring. She envisioned a safer future for him, perhaps as an accountant or doctor, far from the dangers of boxing. Despite her hopes, Matthew's determination never faltered. Over time, his hard training paid off. His stamina improved, his lung capacity grew, and he could now finish a full round without collapsing from exhaustion. Matthew's speed sharpened, his punches became more precise, and with each day he shed the weakness of his past. No longer the overlooked boy, he was turning into the challenger Hector never expected. That afternoon, Hector and his gang tried to provoke him again. This time, Matthew refused to back down. When Hector challenged him, he accepted immediately, and they headed to the gym to settle it. The fight was far from fair. Hector fought dirty, and his friends quickly joined in. Overwhelmed, Matthew was knocked to the ground. Just then, Dan appeared, his presence stopping them in their tracks. With a firm voice, he warned that if they didn't stop, he would report everything to the school administration, ensuring Hector and Joy's expulsion. Coach Howard arrived and immediately sided with his starfighters. Turning to Dan, he threatened bluntly, if Dan interfered with the team's top boxers, he'd lose his job. Howard reminded Dan that as a janitor, he was easily replaceable, and his long-standing relationship with the principal meant she would never take Dan's word over his. But instead of arguing, Dan pulled Howard aside for a private conversation and made a bold proposal: let Matthew compete in the upcoming boxing event. If Matthew was truly weak, he would fail on his own. But if he had potential, this was his chance to prove it. Confident Hector's spot was secure, Howard agreed to let Matthew compete, but with one condition: he needed a signed permission letter from his parents. Matthew knew that would be a challenge his mother would never approve. When he came home with a black eye, her worry turned to shock. She couldn't believe what Matthew had been doing after school, and the realization that he was entering a world of violence, the very thing she had always shielded him from, filled her with fear. The next day, Dan brought the news. Matthew was excited about the opportunity, but a lingering worry remained. He knew his mother would never approve, and now that she understood the dangers, convincing her seemed impossible. Then, Dan told Matthew he couldn't hide behind his mother forever. If he didn't fight for the respect he deserved, he would regret it forever. With only weeks until the event, Dan vowed to teach him everything he knew. They trained in secret, pushing harder each day. When the time came, Matthew would know how to convince his mother. As the competition neared, his mother's refusal remained firm. Left with no choice, Matthew forged her signature and submitted the registration form. That evening, Matthew went to Dan's workshop, eager to train, but Dan was missing. Undeterred, he pushed through the exercises alone before heading home. When he stepped inside, he froze. His principal was there, sitting with his parents. She had called his mother to verify her consent, and now all his secrets were exposed. Trapped by his lies, Matthew had no choice but to confess everything to his parents and the principal. Matthew confessed how Hector and his friends had tormented him since day one, making his life unbearable. All he wanted was a chance to stand up to them and earn the respect he deserved. But now, due to one signature, that chance was taken from him. When he asked about Dan, the principal delivered a crushing blow. Dan had been fired for allegedly inciting violence. Rage flooded Matthew, and without another word he stormed out, leaving his mother fuming at his defiance. For Matthew, this wasn't just about defiance, it was about reclaiming his life. He refused to live in fear any longer. Determined, he found Dan, now living on a boat. Standing before his former mentor, Matthew apologized for the trouble he'd caused and begged Dan to continue training him for the upcoming fight. Dan met his gaze and said there was nothing more to teach. Matthew had mastered every technique. Now, he needed to make amends with his parents and prepare to face Hector. Matthew paused to absorb Dan's words, then headed home, a new determination fueling him. After days of reflection, his mother finally gave him permission to compete and promised to be there, supporting him in the most important fight of his life. On the big day, Matthew entered the ring, greeted by the cheers of family and friends. Even his father had traveled a long distance to witness this defining moment. Howard entered the ring and firmly laid out the rules: 3 one-minute rounds with 45 seconds of rest between them. The judges would decide the winner. The bell rang, and the fight began. Hector quickly took control, launching a barrage of powerful punches at Matthew's head. Forced onto defense, Matthew struggled to withstand Hector's relentless assault throughout the first round. In the second round, Hector landed a brutal liver shot, sending searing pain through Matthew's body. He staggered, barely staying upright, but the bell rang just in time to end the round. Dan and his father rushed to his corner. Kneeling beside him, Dan's voice was steady and firm, reminding Matthew that the pain would fade, but his courage, something no one could take from him, would remain. 25. As the final round began, memories of Hector's taunts fueled Matthew's resolve. Summoning every ounce of strength, he landed a powerful punch that sent Hector crashing to the mat, shocking the crowd. The referee began the count, but Hector barely rose in time to continue. When the match ended, Hector was declared the winner. In an unexpected move, Hector extended his hand to Matthew, a silent gesture of respect. Though Hector was declared the winner, Howard stepped forward, urging the crowd to applaud Matthew's courage. Then, to everyone's surprise, he announced that Matthew would take over as the school team's lead fighter, as Hector was set to graduate. The film closes with Matthew standing tall, no longer just a fighter, but the school's rising star, someone who earned respect through sheer perseverance. His greatest victory wasn't the match's outcome, but his unwavering courage to fight for what he believed in.